Okay. On Thanksgiving Day, 1938, I received a letter from my mother, and in which she said, among other things, that grandfather and Hans and my sister-in-law, her name is Ellen, that her father are no longer around, that they had to leave, hopefully for a short time, something to that effect. And that, to me, spelled out that they were picked up at the time of the Crystal Night and were either in concentration camps or imprisoned or something. By that time, of course, I had heard the Crystal Night was in the papers and on the news here. And I knew that all the men between 16 and 65 had been taken. And I was anxiously awaiting mail from home to find out what was going on. And with that letter, I got the weight to realize that this is the time to go ahead and do something. And they were ready to do it, but only for Hans and Ellen, because I guess he had inquired as to what kind of financial backing is necessary and found out that this financial situation and his professional standing was just enough for 2 people. But he did tell me at that time then that there is a family in Greeley by the name of Meyer who own a dry goods store, and I'd been in and out of the dry goods stores many times, who I guess they were the only Jewish family in Greeley who probably would be able to help me with the rest of the family. So Wallace called Charlie Meyer on Thanksgiving Day and told him about me and what it was all about. And Charlie said, well, why don't you come over after dinner and we'll talk about it, which Wallace and I did then. And Charlie had immigrated from Poland in the early 1900s and became a very successful businessman in the United States. And when I told him what family I have and everything, he said, yes, I'll give the affidavits for the rest of them.
And who were the rest? Your mother?
My mother, my sister-in-law's parents, and my sister-in-law's sister.
And where were your mother's 2 sisters?
The one sister, the one that was the mother of my cousin, she was still in Frankfurt, but her husband at that time was in France, and he had gotten word to her that she needs to meet him in France. In other words, get out. She had a passport, and she could get into France at any time, and their daughter was going to a boarding school in Switzerland, so she was out of the country too. And the other sister had immigrated to Buenos Aires in 1937. She had an uncle and a cousin there.
And your father's siblings, do you know?
They were all in Germany. Yeah. And in fact, only one of them got to the United States, and I think he came after that, but he had relatives through his deceased wife in San Francisco, and they helped him. And my grandparents, my mother's parents, were still in Frankfurt also. But I felt that that wasn't my responsibility, that I would get affidavits for my brother and our mother and his wife's people. And the next morning then Charlie drove down to Denver. It's just only about 80 miles from Greeley to Denver, and got the affidavits all set up and everything, and made arrangements. And as soon as the papers were ready, I mailed them home. And I guess Wallace went with him also and set up the papers that he was going to do for my brother and his wife. And somehow my brother was able to get out of concentration camp after about a month or so. And by the time he got back,
Where was he?
in Buchenwald. And by the time he came back, the affidavits were in Frankfurt. And of course, they knew they couldn't get into the States right away because of the quota. And my sister-in-law, Ellen, had an aunt and uncle in England, and they could go to England. So they went to England.
And when was that?
I think it was early in 1939, in January of 1939. Yes, it must have been, because they spent 13 months in England before they could get here, and they got here in March of 1940.
Did her parents go also?
No, they couldn't get out. But the sister had already left by the time the affidavits came through another relative. So that affidavit really wouldn't have been necessary, but so be it. And her parents never got out, and neither did my mother. And at that time, my mother, let's see, this was in 1938. Then in 1939, we finally convinced my mother that she needs to get out too, and she started to make arrangements and everything, and I made arrangements from this side to pay for her ticket and everything. She had evidently gotten a fairly low number to get out. No, I guess not any lower than Hans and Ellen's, because she was in Holland in May of 1940 in Amsterdam to come to the United States.
She was on her way.
Yes. She had taken care of everything in Frankfurt that she needed to take care of to get out, and she was on her way and was in Amsterdam, and she was to sail on the 10th of May, and on the 9th of May the Nazis overran Holland, and she never got out. And I found out about the Nazi invasion when I came back from work one evening at 11 o'clock from the switchboard to my room in the dormitory. My roommate had left the news on for me, like she always did when I came in late. And I'd heard what had happened in Germany, in Holland that day. And I just knew that she was never going to get out. I knew which shipping company she was going to be with, and I called in New York that night. Yet I went back over to the dormitory where the switchboard was, and I opened it for myself to make a long distance call, and which was quite brazen at that time. But I felt I'll settle with the college somehow as far as money was concerned. And I did get a hold of somebody at the shipping company, and they said, yes, as far as we know, that ship was even sunk that your mother was supposed to be on. And other than that, we know nothing what's going on in Holland. So I knew mother was caught there. And what can you do? By that time, my brother and his wife had come to the States. They were living in Denver then. And I talked to them on the phone the next morning, and they had also gotten that information. All you can do is wait. And eventually I heard from my mother, and Hans did too. I don't know if she wrote to both of us, but we were in contact with her again later on that year. And while she was even still in Frankfurt, she had become quite friendly with a Mr. Solomon, Arnold Solomon, who was the widower of some friends of ours. And Hans and I knew him. And Arnold was a Dutchman by birth, but he lived in Germany all the time, and was evidently he had a dual citizenship. Anyhow, Arnold already had gone back to Holland. He had two children. a boy who had immigrated to Bolivia, I believe, and a girl who was with him in Holland, about my age too. And he was back in Holland, and mother knew this, and I guess they had been in contact after she got to Holland, and when she was stranded there then, he saw to it that there was a place for her to live and all that, and they both went into hiding. A Gentile family hid them, and eventually they got married. And because Arnold had gotten the Iron Cross in the First World War, he had the privilege of taking his wife to the same concentration camp with him. So at least they could stay together. And
How were they caught?
the family that had been hiding them could no longer do it. They became too afraid that they are being suspected. A lot of families were hiding people, and of course the Nazis knew this, and they were doing more and more hunting of people, and it was a matter of survival, whether you asked the people whom you were hiding to leave or not. And they had to come out of hiding, and they were imprisoned. They were transported to the Dutch concentration camp Westerbroek, and were there for I don't know how long. But before too long, they were transported to Theresienstadt, which was in Czechoslovakia. And off and on, I would hear from mother, either directly or through somebody else. And I had gotten in touch with the Red Cross and asked them to send her food packages. By that time, I had a little bit more money at hand, and they were supposed to send her a food package every month, and I understand that that didn't happen too often. But that's another story. And anyhow, then of course in 1941, America got into the war, and then I didn't hear anything directly at all anymore. I had an uncle by that time, one of my father's brothers, who had immigrated to Switzerland, and he at times could tell us a little bit or something about mother. And by that time also my grandmother had immigrated to Buenos Aires. In fact, she and my grandfather were on their way to Buenos Aires from Spain in the summer of 1941. And my grandfather died on board ship, and the ship was stopped in Pernambuco in order to bury him in the Jewish cemetery there. And
What did he die of?
I imagine it was a kidney infection. He had had prostate trouble that could not be fixed, and I know that grandmother had to catheterize him, and I imagine that it was a situation of infection under poor circumstances. At that time, I guess grandfather must have been in his high 70s already also, and they both had suffered quite a bit in Germany. Not physical, but hunger and worry about their daughters and grandchildren. But anyhow, they couldn't get word to my aunt in Buenos Aires that her father had died on the way, and she was waiting for her parents at the pier in Buenos Aires, and only her mother comes off, which was a terrible shock for her, naturally. But grandmother made a pretty good adjustment in Buenos Aires. She and Aunt Elsa lived together until my grandmother died, which wasn't until 1956. She got to be quite old.
Did you see her?
No, I never saw my grandmother again, but after I got married in 1948, I started to correspond with her more, and primarily because my husband more or less insisted that I do this for this old lady. He had much more of a feeling that way than I did. I really didn't feel all that kindly towards my grandmother, But he said, let bygones be bygones. She is all alone there now except for Elsa. And we are married now. We have the small children. Tell her about what her great-grandchildren are doing and stuff like that. And so I did. Of course, I had to do it in German, and it was not easy, just like it's not all that easy for me to write in German now. But at that time, Jim would go over my letters. His German was much better, or is much better even now, and he would at least correct my spelling mistakes. And so she and I had quite a good relationship in those last years of her life. In fact, my aunt used to tell me that I was the only one of the 3 grandchildren she had who would write to her, and that she was always delighted to hear what I was doing in the household and with the children and all that. And so it was rewarding in a way. And she did write nice letters, and she embroidered a few things for the babies, and that meant quite a bit to me. And I got to see her good qualities as we both matured. But let's see, where were we? Oh, about my mother. Then after America got into the war, I had no contact with her at all directly anymore, just through this grandmother who occasionally would hear, like somebody maybe would hear from somebody that was in a concentration camp. And there was a great grapevine going every place, and it's amazing how news got out about different people. But there wasn't much contact. But and it was during that time that mother was in the concentration camp that the Waits wanted to adopt me as their daughter. And I felt very honored, but I told them, let's wait and see if my mother survives this. I don't think that she would take too kindly to coming over here and finding out that her youngest child had been adopted by somebody. And they could understand that. They just hadn't thought that far. But that's how much the Waits thought of me, which was very gratifying. And let's see. Yes, then in 1940, I think it was, in the fall, I had a chance to interrupt my, or maybe it was 41, no, it was 1940. During summer school, a dean of women from a girls' junior college in Illinois was on our campus looking for someone who could be an assistant dietitian and perhaps do some teaching also. And she and I were brought together, and it ended up that I took that position as assistant dietitian and assistant chemistry instructor on the campus of Monticello Junior College in Alton, Illinois. And that I would come back then in the summertime to pick up more of my college work in order to get my degree, because I was just past my sophomore year. And I did that, and yeah, that was 1940. I started teaching there in 40. And then the following year, of course, in December was Pearl Harbor. And I suddenly became an enemy alien. I had not been able to get naturalized by then. I was supposed to get my papers in 1941 when I turned 21. I took out my first papers as early as I could. I think that was when I was 15. But you couldn't get your second papers until you were at least 21, or there had been 3 years between the first papers and the second paper, something like that. Anyhow, when they were working on my papers in 1941, they discovered that one of the women from the Jewish committee who had been put down to verify about my character for that time span that I was in Pennsylvania had lost her citizenship when she married in 1924 or so. It was a great big mix-up. But this Mrs. Dubinsky was officially not an American citizen anymore, because the man she married had assumed that he became an American citizen when his father became an American citizen, which was not the case at that time. And so he really wasn't an American citizen, and she lost her citizenship. But yet somehow they both had traveled overseas and had American passports. Anyhow, the Immigration and Naturalization Department would not accept this woman as my representative for that time. And I had to find somebody else. And that moved it up another whole year. So I knew I wasn't going to get my citizenship papers at the earliest in the summer of 1942. So from December 7th on, I was an enemy alien.
What do you mean by that?
I could not go more than a radius of 20 miles from where I was. I had to turn in my camera. I had to turn in my radio because it had a shortwave band on it. And I was just told to watch my step. You are a damn German. But yet I wasn't a German either, because the Nazis didn't recognize Jews as Germans anymore. So I was a girl without a country. But it didn't hamper me too much, because the chief of police in Godfrey, Illinois, which was the closest town to us, knew me quite well, and the fellow I was dating also, and he always said, go wherever you want to go.
Was there a curfew?
No. And this junior college was way out in the country, so there was nothing that I would have missed if I couldn't have gone to it. And my life really didn't change too much, but I was more careful what I said. We had one German-born teacher on the faculty there, and she and I never did see eye to eye, even before this all happened. So I stayed out of her way as much as possible. And then in the fall of 1942, I guess it was, one time the principal of that school said to me, you know, we only hired you out of pity because you were from Germany. And I said, well, you can stop being pitiful towards me now. I'm resigning as of now. And I quit in the middle of the year because it had gotten worse for me there. They had moved me out of the girls' dormitory into the employees' quarters, and it just showed me that the principal was behind trying to get me out. So I did him the favor and resigned. And I went back to school full time and graduated then from college in the summer of '43 with my degree. In the meantime, while I was teaching, I had been able to save enough money so that I didn't have to work that last half year at school, and I could pick up all the credits that I needed in order to graduate.
When did you hear from your mother again?
I don't know. I don't remember. Off and on.
You said when the United States entered the war, there was a period of time when you did not hear from her.
Until the war was over. I didn't hear from her directly anymore. I only heard about her, because she was at Theresienstadt. They both were, she and Arnold, were at Theresienstadt. And ever so often there was a transport to Auschwitz or some of the other camps, and somehow Mother's name, I guess, was never on the list of people to go. Arnold's was, but somehow he always managed to not be there when they were leaving, and until the very last transport that left in 1945. And we never heard anything more about him from there. But my mother survived in Theresienstadt. She was there when the Americans came in and liberated them. And that's when I heard then again. That was in 1945. By that time, I had enlisted in the American Army Medical Corps as a dietitian. Perhaps in order to keep this chronologically, after I graduated from college, I went into my internship, one-year internship for dietetics. Half of it I took in the civilian hospital in Denver from the medical school hospital, and the other half under civil service at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, which was possible for us at that time to take half of our internship there with the understanding that we would accept a commission in the Army Medical Corps then. And I did that because I have always felt that I owe a great deal to this country. And since I knew I wasn't going to be drafted, I was going to offer my services. And I was in the service. In fact, I was in Hawaii when I heard directly from my mother again. Well, not really directly either. I got a telegram one day, and it gave the name Lily Salomon, Venlo, Holland, and an address. That's all the telegram said. It was in the summer of 1945. And I couldn't figure out what that was all about, because I never wrote to my mother as Mrs. Salomon. See, there was no address that I could write to her after she married Arnold.
Did you know she had married?
Oh yes, that I knew, And at first I couldn't figure out what that was all about. And suddenly I realized my brother had sent me that address that was our mother, and that's all he could say. Telegrams were very expensive at that time, and they were short on money. And that's all he sent. And I guess I must have fainted, because the next thing I knew, there was a bunch of soldiers trying to revive me. I was lying flat on the floor. And they asked me then, of course, what caused you to faint? What is this all about? Because it didn't make any sense to the telephone operator who took that message either. And I explained it to them then. And it was a small branch of the General Hospital that I was in at that time. And by the time I got to lunch, all the staff knew about it, and everybody in the dining room stood up when I walked in the dining room. And that evening, the officers gave a party for my mother. We were always looking for excuses for parties anyhow, so this was a good excuse to have a party, that my mother survived the concentration camp and that she was back in Venlo. And the reason why she went there was that she and Arnold had long ago agreed that either one of them survives this ordeal, that they would go back to Holland, to Venlo, where they married and had lived before the concentration camp, and wait for each other for 1 year to see if the other one would show up. Well, Mother stayed there until the year was up, and she never heard anything. She asked and searched every place possible for him, and no one ever knew anything about him. So we assume that on the way from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz, somehow he died. How, we don't know. And
did you want her to come sooner?
Well, yes, of course I would have wanted her to, but first of all, I was in the service. I couldn't, and I was overseas. I couldn't have her stay with me. It was a matter of my brother taking her on. And secondly, she wrote to me then, we found out, she wrote to my brother always then afterwards, after she was liberated. And he sent me copies of the letters. And she had made this agreement with Arnold, and she wasn't going to go back on it. I would have thought very poorly of her if she hadn't kept that promise. But then in 1946, in November, she did come to the United States. By that time, I was stationed on Guam, but I got emergency leave to meet her in New York City, which I did, and it was almost 12 years to the day when we met again. And it was quite emotional. It so happened that the day that she was landing, she came by air. And it was very foggy in New York. And I knew that the plane was circling overhead. And I also knew that if it was going to have to circle for quite a while, for about another half hour or so, it was going to run out of fuel unless it went to like either Washington or Boston to land. And I thought, well, this would be the irony of it all. But they did come down in New York, and I was standing at the gate there. I was in uniform, and the Red Cross woman asked me why I was there. She knew the flight was coming from Holland. And I told her, and she said, well, what are you doing here? Go on out where you can meet her as she gets off the flight. And I said, well, I don't think I'm supposed to. And she said, you go ahead, I tell you to. Because I wasn't supposed to make contact with her until after she had gone through customs. But so we met on the Tamarack there and hugged each other, and I knocked her glasses off her face and broke them. And the first thing she said, that's my second pair of glasses, that's broken, I don't have any more glasses. So, but I took her downtown someplace in New York then. It was quite a reunion. And we spent the first couple nights in a hotel in New York City, and then we moved out to Ridgefield Park, New Jersey, where this Otto Ettlinger, who met me years ago, was living, and he had married in the meantime, and mother's sister, who had married another, the Ettlinger, and her husband had come from Europe, and they were living in Ridgefield Park with Otto by that time. What had happened to the Ettlingers was that eventually they all left France and emigrated to Palestine and lived in Palestine until the war was over. And in the summer of 1946, when before my mother came over here, they came through, they came from Palestine to the United States, and they came through Holland, and they saw my mother. So I had heard some things about my mother from them before mother came. And mother and I visited there for a few days, and then we flew to Denver. My brother couldn't come to meet her because his wife was expecting the second child at any time. And that's then when my brother and my mother got together again, and mother met her first grandchild. They had one little girl who was about 3.5, almost 4 years old by that time. And then I left mother in Denver and went back on active duty. I didn't go back overseas. I went first to New Jersey, and from there to Walter Reed General Hospital in Washington, D.C. And that's where I was discharged then. They wanted me to sign up again, but they wouldn't promise me that they'd send me overseas again. And I didn't want to serve in the States, especially not at Walter Reed, and I suspected that they wanted to keep me there, and that was just too much formality for me. So I got out of the service and went back first to Colorado, thinking that I would get a job there, but my mother and I wouldn't have been able to live together as long as I wasn't married, because anytime I had a date, she was very anxious for me to get serious about somebody, and I wasn't about to be told by a mother after all these years having been on my own whom I should marry and whom I shouldn't. And I was able to get a job in Philadelphia at the Jewish hospital there, and that's where I went in 1947. And while I was working there, I met my husband, not in Philadelphia, but in New York. I want to go back someplace in 1946 when my mother came. She knew that I hadn't been hearing anything from a very dear girlfriend of mine from Frankfurt. Her name was Friedel Meyer. She and I lived in the same area, and we went to school together every day, and were very close friends. And I left in '34, as I've said before, and I corresponded with Friedel until she finally had a chance to immigrate to Yugoslavia in 1939. And then I never heard from her again, which wasn't surprising because of what was going on. And when my mother came over in 1946 and we were in New York, she said, I have an address of Friedel's aunt. Let's go look her up and see if she knows anything about Friedel. And we did that, and this aunt told us that Friedel did get to Yugoslavia all right, and eventually got on a ship that was going from Yugoslavia to Palestine. and that the ship was torpedoed. Nobody survived, which was not too surprising either. So that was that. And then, let's see.
Back to meeting your husband.
Oh yes, that's right. When my mother and I were in New York, we also looked up the daughter of friends of mother's who died at Theresienstadt when mother was there. And she wanted, mother wanted to give this daughter, her name was Irmgard Meyer. She was married by that time. She wanted to give her the details because that information would perhaps help her in getting restitution from Germany. And that was also the time that Irmgard and I made contact again. We had known each other in Frankfurt, and part of the time we went to school together also. And when I was stationed at Walter Reed, at times I would come to New York and spend the weekend with her and her husband. And they were quite anxious to find me a boyfriend.
How old were you at this time?
Over 26. Well, they knew Jewish people in New York and all that, so it was logical. And then when I came back to the East to work, I had a job, as I think I said, at the Jewish hospital in Philadelphia. And quite fairly often I would go to New York and either be with Irmgard or with my aunt and uncle in Ridgefield Park, New Jersey. And Irmgard and her husband Walter had this friend whom I just must meet because he'd be just right for me. But he was never in town the weekends that I came. So eventually they decided, well, we have to produce somebody. And Irmgard worked with a German woman, and she had a brother whom they knew, who they thought I might like to meet. So in January of 1948, one weekend when I was with them, there comes this this brother of this friend, whose name was James Magnus, and we became acquainted and kind of liked each other and got to know each other a little bit better and corresponded quite a bit. I was back in Philadelphia then again by that time. And well, to make a long story short, it wasn't a long story anyhow, because after 8 weeks of knowing each other, we got married in March of 1948. And we're still married to each other.
And he was from Germany also?
Yes, he comes from Königsberg, which is in East Prussia. East Prussia no longer exists. It is part of Russia now, not even East Germany. It was never East Germany. It has always been Russia. And he came from there in 1936. And as I said, we got married in March of 48. My family had not met him and weren't about to meet him until about a year later, because we had decided before we got married that when we start a family, we're not going to have the children grow up in New York City. And the sister with whom Irmgard had been working had in the meantime moved out to Portland, Oregon. And my family was in Denver, but I knew that Jim had always been very, very close to his sister, the one that moved to Portland, so we decided that we'd move to Portland. Also, I had come through the Pacific Northwest region one time when I was on a troop transport from California to Washington, and liked the scenery very much that I had seen. And in fact, I remember waking up in the morning and asking the porter where we are, because I saw this fog hanging in these beautiful pine trees and everything. He said, I don't really know exactly where, but someplace in Oregon. I can still hear myself saying, someday I'd like to live there. And that's where we came then in 1949.
What did your husband do for work?
Well, he was in business office work. And he also was in the service, so he hadn't been working too long, well, about 2 or 3 years, and he had always been in a business type thing. In Germany, he had a very thorough training in business administration, I guess you would call it here. But you never get a diploma for that in Germany like you do here. So he really had nothing to show for his efforts. If Hitler hadn't happened, first of all, Jim and I would never have met. And secondly, Jim would have inherited or taken over his father's manufacturing of paper goods. They had a very large concern in Königsberg, and it was a very well-going concern. But he was familiar with working in the paper goods branch, and he tried to get back into it here in America. He did a little bit of it before he was drafted, and then afterwards he did sales and office work in different concerns. He really didn't have too much of profession, in fact nothing of a profession, but he was always able to get into the offices that he wanted to. But then when we wanted to move away, he decided to take some lines with him to the West Coast to represent as a traveling salesman. His brother-in-law had taken some lines back out here, and they wanted to enlarge the business, do it together, and travel in the Pacific Northwest as a traveling salesman. And that's what he did first when we came out here. But though he always made enough in order to pay our expenses, he didn't want to continue doing that and be out on the road all the time. So he eventually bought a neighborhood grocery store in North Portland, and at the same time took a correspondence course in accounting in order to get into that. And once he had gotten his diploma from LaSalle University in Chicago, which was the correspondence school, which was in 1953, then he started to work as an accountant in different firms. First retail here in Portland, and his last firm was Schnitzer Steel. He was there for 13 years before he retired.
How about you? Did you work when you came here?
I was pregnant when we came out here, and I didn't as long as the children were small. We had 2 sons within a year, and then for a while I took in some other children for daycare, but not too much. And once our youngest was ready to go into kindergarten, I started working in the Portland school system as a dietitian. At that time they were using dietitians to run the cafeterias. And I've stayed in dietetics all the time. As long as the children were at home, I only worked part-time in order to be home when they were out of school. And then the last few years I worked full-time, and I worked in different hospitals here and at the University of Oregon Dental School and Medical School, and did some teaching at the community college, and also in the public schools I did some substitute teaching, and at Good Samaritan Hospital, when they still had their School of Nursing, I taught dietetics there. My last job was at Physicians and Surgeons Hospital for about 7.5 years. And then I retired. Jim retired in 1976, and I retired in 1977. And we did quite a bit of traveling during those early retirement years. But unfortunately, in 1982, Jim suffered a very severe hypoperfusion stroke during open heart surgery. And he's been a complete invalid since then. And until a year ago last May of 1991, I took care of him at home, but since then I haven't been able to, and at this time he is at the Veterans Administration nursing home in Vancouver. Jim has a service-connected disability, and that enabled him to get medical care from the Veterans Administration. And I don't care what anybody else says about the medical care from the VA. What Jim has received has been very good, and I'm very satisfied with how they have taken care of him. And one interesting thing that happened was last November. It has nothing to do with Jim, but the Jewish school that I went to in Frankfurt had a world reunion in Monticello, New York. And with taking care of Jim all these years, the VA has also allowed us to have 4 weeks of respite a year. And as soon as I found out about that, I took advantage of it, because you cannot be a full-time caregiver for 24 hours a day, 12 months a year, and not go under. So I've always broken up my 4 weeks into two-week sections, and that way I always had something to look forward to within the next 6 months. And that's how come, first of all, I decided to go to that 50th school reunion in 1988. And that's also why I decided to go to the school reunion of the Jewish school in Monticello, New York. I really wasn't that crazy about the school, as I've said before, and I didn't have much contact with any of my former schoolmates, only this Irmgard Meyer, really. But I went, and Irmgard went also, and my cousin from Israel came, and we went, and I met quite a few of the schoolmates then, and all of them asked me what became of Friedel. And I told them that she was killed in this torpedo attack. Now, as I said before, that was in November of 1991. On the 9th of January of 1992, this year, I received a letter from England. And you can, if you're used to getting foreign mail, you can kind of tell from which country the different things come. And I realized right away that was from England. And I was corresponding with one woman in England. And I thought, well, why would she be writing to me already again? We just exchanged letters. And I turned the letter over to see the return address, and that name didn't mean a thing. My first thought was, well, it's somebody that heard about the school reunion, and they're trying to get funds for something in England, and somebody soliciting funds. And I opened the letter, and I saw it was typed, and I saw the signature. Without even reading it, I knew right away it was Friedel's. And I nearly fainted. And I talked to her that same evening. What had happened was that instead of going to Palestine by boat, she went by land, bus and train, and got to Palestine. Her sister had gotten there ahead of her, I believe, and eventually she enlisted in the Jewish regiment or platoon of the British Army from Palestine, and she was stationed in the Cairo area, and met one of the soldiers, and just accidentally, and on one furlough, and another time on a leave. They hadn't kept in contact at all in between, but they happened to meet again on another leave. And from that, friendship developed that to the extent that in 1946, he could persuade her to come to England and look the place over, because when he asked her to marry him, she had refused. And she went and had a visa for 3 months, and before the visa ran out, they got married. And this was in 1946 that they got married. But at that time, she didn't let her aunt know about it. And that's how come I heard from her aunt that she had died. But she hadn't died. In all these years, she had been trying to contact me. And she knew about this reunion of the school in Monticello, New York. And she had one contact here in the States of somebody from the school, and she wrote to that woman and asked if she could get a list of the people that are going to be attending, if it has the maiden names on it, because she'd asked different people whom she knew had been in the States, and nobody could tell her where I was. Well, this woman said, no, there is no list with the maiden names. So she decided not to even come to the reunion, especially since she and her husband had visited in the States earlier that year. But after the reunion, there was a list with the maiden names, and this contact that she has here in the States sent her that list, and that's where she found my name, because my maiden name was on there, and that's what produced this letter. So, of course, I was shocked. I called this contact person right away when Friedel told me through how she had gotten my name. And it wasn't the time to call in England. It was about 6 o'clock at night here, and that was in the middle of the night in England. So I talked to this woman in the East first, and she said also that she has never met Friedel. She has only corresponded with her. She knows that she is visited in the States, and that was that. So I stayed up until midnight to call Friedel, which was about 7 o'clock or so over there. And she was really surprised to hear me on the phone. Like she told me later, I didn't think that you were going to call. It never occurred to her. And she was prepared to wait another 2 or 3 weeks before she'd hear from me. So we talked about 10 minutes that evening, and since then the letters have been going back and forth, something fierce. And this summer I was in Frankfurt, Germany, because the city of Frankfurt invited me together with 125 other people to come back as a gesture of goodwill. Many of the cities have been doing that over the last 10, 15 years to bring refugees back if they wanted to, in order to try to rectify something that was done to us. And the cities take the people that came from their cities themselves. So I was asked by Frankfurt this year, and I'd hoped that they would ask Friedel also, but they didn't this year for various reasons. But there were 3 days that we didn't have anything scheduled by the city, so I told Friedel about it, and she and her husband came to Frankfurt at that time. Otherwise, they would have come to Wiesbaden in Germany, because they knew that I was going to spend an extra week in Wiesbaden after the reunion, after this get-together in Frankfurt. So we finally got to see each other face to face this summer. And that brings us up to date.
What happened to your mother?
My mother lived in Denver, and first she did household work, and then she decided to work in a hospital where they were looking for a cook, and she ended up being the chief special diet cook at the National Jewish Hospital in Denver, and retired there in the early 60s, and no, I guess it was later, probably the middle 60s. And she died in 1973. In fact, I brought her out here the last 2 weeks of her life, and she died here at Physicians and Surgeons Hospital. She developed gangrene in one leg, and we knew what her wishes were, and she's buried here in Portland.
And how old was she?
73. No, wait a second, 81. It was in 1973 that she died. She got to be 81 years old.
And I have just a few questions about your life, your own family, with your husband and your 2 sons.
Yes, and we have 6 grandchildren.
6 grandchildren.
One son lives here in town, and the other one lives in the San Francisco area. He has 3 small children, a set of twins that'll be 9 years old. No, wait a second. No, yeah, they'll be 8 years old this year, and a little girl who was just 3. And he has a 16-year-old daughter from a previous marriage who lives here in town. And the other son has 2 children, a boy who's almost 14 and a girl who's almost 9.
What are their names?
The ones here in town are Greg and Rika, and the 16-year-old girl is Melissa, and the twins are Max and Sam, and the little girl is Esther.
And your other son? What is your other son's name?
Oh, one's name is Ron, and the other one is Tom. The one in San Francisco is Tom.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of a Jewish life did you have as your children were growing up?
We didn't. We joined the Unitarian Church when it was time for the children to be exposed to something, primarily because several years before my husband left Germany, he had already joined the Lutheran Church. And I never even asked him to go back to Judaism. And over the years, Judaism hasn't meant that much to me. Especially once I got in the service, there was very little contact that I had with Jewish activities. Being a woman in the service, you're kind of left out in left field anyhow, and a Jewish woman at that. The only time when I really had some contact with some Jewish people was on Guam. There was a small group of us that would get together, and it was primarily for social purposes. We could always get good wine through the small congregation that we formed. But I was the only Jewish woman. The others were some of the fellows, and I don't think there were more than 8 or 10 of us from all the services on Guam. And the way my life developed, I was just never in contact with Jewish people to that extent. And I felt more Americanized, I guess. And when we moved out here, I had no real desire to, and also because of Jim's background, like I said before, it isn't that we never had any contact with Jewish people. On the contrary, we knew a lot of Jewish people here. We belonged to the, what was that club called? There was a club here at one time for the Jewish refugees that came to the area, which was quite active. Of course, now there's hardly anybody left because of people dying. And Jim's sister, who came out here before we did, she also didn't follow a Jewish life. Her son, however, and his wife have become quite Jewish. You might know of them, Claude and Kelly Ullman. They have been quite active in the Jewish community here. And I know that the other lady that interviewed me, Sylvia, that she knows them. And that, I guess, about answers that question.
You mentioned that you had been interviewed before. Can you just tell us briefly what other interviews or articles have been written about you, or have you done any writing?
Oh, well, there has been something about finding my girlfriend again. And then years ago, when Jim was still at home, at one year when they were doing quite a bit in recognition of caregivers, we were interviewed by Channel 2 and were on the TV at that time. And then ever so often somebody seems to become interested in our background, and we're not reluctant to talk about it.
Well, in a little while we'll show the newspaper articles. The autobiography that you wrote, what was the purpose of that? Was it just for yourself?
Yes, at the time it was for myself, and then since then I feel that it will be something that will help my grandchildren. Unfortunately, my husband isn't about to record anything, and I've been saying for several years now that I should sit down at least with a tape recorder and put down what I know about his background for the grandchildren. Of course, our sons know about it because we've talked about it always at home.
When did you write this autobiography?
Oh, I don't remember. I don't remember. But over the years, ever so often, I will have put things down on paper. Also, while I was in the service, it was usually like kind of a letter to myself. And so there are other things on record about me also, not stopping with this thing. But this is the thing that is of most interest to most people these days because of my Jewish background.
Are either of your sons' families Jewish?
No, they're not anything, not even Unitarian.
And what would you like others to learn from your experiences, from your telling the story in this way?
About the horrible things that human beings can do to each other, which of course is what was the worst thing that Hitler could have done. If he wouldn't have persecuted anybody, he would have gone down in history as a great statesman, probably. But of course he couldn't have accomplished his goals as he had set them out to be without persecution of somebody. And of course it wasn't only the Jews who were persecuted, others also. In fact, one time when Jim and I were traveling in Europe, we were on a train from Frankfurt to Vienna and shared the compartment with a retired ophthalmologist from Vienna who turned out to have been a Catholic who was interned in Theresienstadt at the same time that my mother was. And it's something that in a way can be forgiven because the people who are alive now were not the instigators of it, but it must never be forgotten. There was a group, there is a group in Frankfurt of people who come to see us, people like I was back in Frankfurt this summer, and talk to us and find out, like I've been telling you now, about our backgrounds, because they bring all this into the schools so that the youngsters who are growing up now are exposed to that and know and realize that this happened in Germany, their fatherland, and that it must never happen again. And let's hope it won't. But nobody knows what the future will bring.
Do you have any questions?
When did you first learn about what was going on in the concentration camps?
I can't put a timetable on it, but I know that when my mother indicated to me that in that letter in 1938 that I received on Thanksgiving Day, that my brother, my grandfather, and my sister-in-law's father were not at home anymore, which I knew meant that they were in the concentration camps, that just sent chills up and down my spine. That's really the first time when it really hit home with me, because it was happening to somebody close. But I must have known about what was going on before.
Do you feel that other people your age or other people you were surrounded with knew what was going on, or did you know because you sort of had an interest, because of your family?
I'm sure that I was much more aware of it than other people. For instance, the woman who lives next door to me now, all of this, what is my background, is so new to her. She had no idea. She is a woman 82 years old. Her husband never was in the service, neither were her sons. So she was really fairly untouched by the Second World War. She has no contacts with foreigners. I'm the first animal like that she has had contact with. And ever so often when I talk about something that is part of my life, she is just aghast that all these things could have happened to somebody, and that these things are going on and were going on. And And I'm sure that there are many other people in that age group and younger too, that somehow have been completely untouched by these things, unfortunately. And I feel that it's something that needs to be brought to the attention of people. I hope when the Holocaust, when the Anne Frank deal comes in the fall, that it'll be in the papers more, so that the community becomes aware of it. Of course, Anne Frank is something that a lot of people are familiar with. And this will probably cement it more.
In the Army, when you were in the service, was there any
anti-Semitism?
Not only anti-Semitism, but anti-German feelings? Were you treated poorly because you were Jewish or German?
Not as a rule. I once had a date with an officer, and by the time he was kind of drunk, he was talking about those damn German Jews, and I got up and left. But on other times, when I was interning at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, we had a prisoner of war camp there, a ward. They were German prisoners of war. And when it was going towards Christmas time, I realized that when they were putting in their food orders, they were ordering items that can only be used in baking cookies. And I brought it to the attention of my superior, and we decided that that wasn't going to happen, that they were not going to do their own Christmas baking down there. So the commanding officer of the hospital asked me to take charge of that ward, but not to let them know what my background is, and not to speak German to them, which I was more than happy to do. And I saw to it that they got the foods they needed, that they were treated according to the Geneva Convention, and that was it. No more, no less. And this went on for close to the half year that I was there. And then just before I got ready to leave that post, the commanding officer said, let's go down there together and let them know that you knew what was going on. Speak some German to them, but don't go without me. So we went down there, and they were just aghast. But I could hear one fellow, the one that was always putting in the food orders behind me, say, now I know why we didn't get the stuff we wanted for the Christmas cookies. That I was onto it. And my German was pretty fluent, and they wanted to know then, of course, how come I speak German so fluently. And I wasn't prepared at all to answer that question. So I made up the lie that my father was an American soldier, and he was stationed in Germany when I was growing up. There were American soldiers stationed in Germany for quite a while. And that's the reason why I speak German so fluently. I never let them know that I was a German Jewish refugee. But that was the only time when I didn't volunteer the information. Other times I've never been ashamed of my background.
Do you have any resentment to Germany, or are you bitter at all?
The Germany as it is right now is really also a product of the after Hitler time. I know that I don't think that I'll ever go back to Frankfurt again now that I've been back under the auspices of this invitation that I had this summer. I've seen everything there that I wanted to look up again. And I don't think I'll want to go back to Germany as a whole, unless, like, my husband has some very dear friends in Germany, in case there might be an opportunity to see them again. But Germany as a whole leaves me pretty cold now. In fact, I'm rather apprehensive of what is going to happen now that East Germany is combined with West Germany. I'm afraid that as the East Germans up their level of their standard of living, they will become quite arrogant again. And together with the West Germans, it might become a very strong military force again, which is something I'm afraid of. And I brought this up when I was in Germany this summer with these friends of my husband's who are Gentiles, and nobody disputed me. In fact, I had one of them said too, yes, this is something that we need to watch against, that it doesn't happen again. So there are apprehensions every place.
Well, you pretty much answered one of my questions just now, but being back in Frankfurt, was it really, how was it to be there, to see all the places that probably had been destroyed or?
Well, I have been back to Frankfurt before.
Right.
My father, remember, was buried after I left. And Jim and I made trips to Europe in 1975, 79, and 81. And each time we included Frankfurt. I never slept in Frankfurt again until the summer. But we spent a few hours each time in Frankfurt. And so I knew about the change of the physical appearance of the city because I'd seen it. There have been more changes since 1981, which was the last time that I was there. But that's only physical, that's just cosmetic. And it was a funny feeling the first night I went to sleep at the hotel in Frankfurt, because suddenly it hit me. It was the first time in 58 years that you're sleeping here again. But it really didn't bother me too much. In a way, it was exciting to meet former classmates. It so happens that in this gathering in Frankfurt, we ended up being 7 or 8 former classmates, women with whom I went to school at this Philanthropine years ago. And just so happened that they were all coming this year. I know of one classmate who lives in Baltimore now. She went last year. She said there wasn't a single person from our class that she knew that was there. So this was a fortunate situation, and I think that's what made it nice for all of us that were able to get together, because the 6 or 7 of us, we kind of stuck together the whole 2 weeks, and it made it almost like a school reunion for us rather than going back to the city. But it did give me a chance to see some things in the city which I had been wanting to see again, and also see things that have been erected since I left, of course. And I was amazed to find out that there is again a Jewish congregation of about 5,000 people, primarily Russian Jews. But they also, like I, don't have that animosity towards Germany because they didn't live through the bad time. My brother, for instance, and his wife cannot understand how I can go back to Germany at all. But when I lived there, it wasn't that bad. I really wasn't hurt to that extent by my experiences there. And it doesn't bother me to go into Germany. But like I said before, I don't think that I'll want to go back because I feel I've seen everything there that I want to. There are other places in Europe that I'd much prefer to go to.
How was the 2 weeks structured? Did they offer
We had
apologies?
no, not so much apologies, but through their actions, they were trying to let us know. There were a few. I was unable to go to the first speech that was given when we were welcomed because I'd gotten ill that morning. But at the last speech that was given before the meeting broke up, they very definitely said that this should never have happened, and that it's something that cannot ever be erased, but it must never recur. And it's unfortunate that it happened, but they didn't come right out and say we're sorry, because how can you be sorry about this? Sure you are. It's something that just must not happen again. And that's why I was glad to talk to some of the people that are working with teachers and school groups in order to keep this alive among the people going to school now. And it is being talked about. It's costing the city of Frankfurt a tremendous amount of money. I heard one figure of 1.5 million marks a year, which is an awful lot of money, especially since the economy is getting very bad in Germany also. Prices are terribly high. And I understand, well, I know that there's a lot of unemployment just like every place else. My goodness, it's after 1 o'clock. You have any other questions?
Yeah, I have one more question.
Okay.
You, correct me if I'm wrong, you mentioned that your brother was taken to Buchenwald.
Mm-hmm.
How did he get out?
You know, I can't remember that. He told me once, and I've forgotten. I should ask him again. But he is very reluctant to talk about these things. And that's why I don't know, maybe one of his daughters knows. I'll be seeing them this fall.
Did he raise his family Jewish?
Yes.
And so his children know the story?
Oh, yes. Yeah. In fact, the daughter who lives in his area in California is very Jewish. She married a Jewish man also. The other daughter married a Gentile, and I don't think that they're doing anything at all about religion one way or the other. But it was very difficult for my brother to accept the Gentile boyfriend of his oldest daughter at first, but now he's very reconciled and he's very fond of him. In fact, many people who didn't know either the daughter or the son-in-law have always thought that the son-in-law is really the son of my brother, and the daughter is the daughter-in-law, because the son is so much like my brother in many ways. The son-in-law, I mean, is so much like my brother. But even though my brother and his wife are very Jewish-oriented, they realized that they could not stand in the way of their daughter's wish when she wanted to marry a non-Jew. I wanted to go back quickly. I just remembered that I said something that I want to tell you about this Gert Fenchel. When my mother got to Denver, she's always been an avid bridge player. In fact, that's what kept her sanity in the concentration camp. But she established contacts and started to play bridge in different people's homes. And she told me this one time she was in a home and she saw some pictures on the wall there, and this one picture looked so familiar to her. And every time she got there, she kept looking at that picture and wanted to know why that looked so familiar to her. And she finally asked the hostess who that is. And she said, well, that was my brother. And what was his name? Gert Fenchel. And Mother said, oh, I know him. Mother didn't know that he was dead. And Mother remembered him from when she chaperoned us for just a day or so in 1934. And this was his sister, at his sister's house, where she was playing bridge.
And how did he die? You said during the war.
Yes, when Germany declared war, he enlisted in the Canadian Army. And then when America went to war, he switched over to the United States Army, and he was killed in Africa. He went overseas.
Just one. I know you're not Jewish anymore, but have you ever had any desire to go to Israel? Or have you?
I've been to Israel. There's Kitty Toha, my cousin. She lives in Israel. And Jim and I went there in 1979, and were very impressed. I'd like to go back. Besides, I like to be with my cousin. We've been together every year since 1988. She used to work for LL, and her husband was a vice president of LL, and they have flying privileges. And she has a daughter living in New York now also, so she's come to the States quite often recently and come out here too.
Well, I think that maybe we should
Call it quits.
but also set up the camera so we can look at some of the things that you brought.
Oh, I see. Okay.
We want to thank you very, very much for giving
You're
us
welcome.
your time today.
I hope I didn't bore you too much. And this is the first picture I received of my mother after she was released from the concentration camp. And this one is also still taken in Holland. That same summer, I guess, 1945. And then this is one of the first ones that I took here in Colorado in 1946 or 47.